What is up, everyone? I am Dono51.
And I am Mekkah.
We are bringing to you Chapter 14 of my Fire Emblem 7 Hector Hard Mode 0% Gross playthrough. Chapter 14 is a first instance in Hector's campaign where the player gets access to the preparations menu, which eases inventory management in the beginning of a chapter. And in addition to the preparations menu, we get a new character, which is Merlinus from the previous chapter, after we saved him from all of the bandits that were out for his goods. If we didn't do that chapter, then we don't get Merlinus here. He still somehow manages to sneak away from the bandits, but you don't get him until chapter 17. And that means that there's a span of a few chapters in which you don't get access to the convoy because that functionality is locked to Merlinus' character. So the way that he works in this game is you have the option to deploy him in every chapter, and as long as he's on the map and doesn't get killed, then you have access to the convoy. And that means that if you were to get an item that exceeds a unit's maximum inventory space, you would be able to send an item to the convoy instead of being forced to drop it. Additionally, it also means that if you were to go shopping, you could buy items that exceeds a unit's inventory space. And that's pretty important for a couple of these chapters, because in this chapter in particular, we use the convoy warp ability, and in the later chapter, we also need Merlinus to be available to maximize our shopping spree.
Another character that's introduced in this chapter is Erik, the NPC mage that Sarah recruits on turn 2. There's a funny quirk about Erik's AI in this chapter as a green unit. If you play limb mode all the way through, and at some point you reset the game between that point and here, then Erik's AI will actually make him move around in the chapter and kill enemies, which makes things more difficult for us. But thankfully, since we did not play limb mode at all, we just went straight into Hector Hard mode, Erik's AI should just stand still and let himself be recruited. So the objective of this chapter is to rout all the enemies, and they're fairly spread out, which is why our units are spread out as well. The brunt of the work is being done by Marcus, to no one's surprise. He's going to go down the middle and kill every enemy there, including the boss. A lot of players, a lot of new players especially, like to send Marcus down to the village instead to recruit Priscilla. But this is unnecessary because Priscilla joins as long as Erik is alive and the village is intact, so as long as you make sure that the village doesn't get destroyed by pirates, there's actually no need to send anyone there. And doing so with Marcus would be a huge waste of his talents.
Because Marcus is carrying the brunt of the work in this chapter, we have to be careful about what items we give him because he only has 5 inventory slots. We had to give him a Silver Lance because that's the only way that he could reasonably one-round KO the boss, Erik. He ends up taking a bunch of damage from Erik's Horse Slayer because even though it's pretty weak in this game, 14 effective might still deals a fair chunk to Marcus if he has to face a whole bunch of other enemies. It takes away like almost half of his HP. He has to have a full inventory because once he picks up the Horse Slayer, he can send away the Silver Lance so he doesn't end up using it all on generic enemies. He needs 3 vulnerary uses to restore HP over the course of this chapter. He gets a little bit unlucky and gets hit by like basically everything that attacks him, but even then he still manages to survive. We had to give him the Javelin in this chapter because most of the enemies that he faces have 7 attack speed, and he gets weighed down by the hand axe, and those are the only limited 1 and 2 range options we have at this point in the game, because we weren't able to visit the armory in chapter 13. Finally, he needs a weapon to use against the rest of the enemies, and because our Iron Lances and Iron Axes are being used by units such as Oswin, Lowen, Bartray, and Dorcas, Marcus is stuck with an Iron Sword, which leaves him short on being able to one-round KO one particular enemy, but that's okay because we are clearing this chapter in 4 turns instead of a more ambitious 3-turn clear.
Yeah, that 3-turn clear involves a lot of more shenanigans, including manipulating the AI of a brigand in the upper left corner by not killing certain enemies, which is as dumb as it sounds, but if you leave certain enemies alive, then that brigand will move downwards instead of to the right, and that is much better for a 3-turn because if he moves downwards, you can actually have him in range on turn 3 enemy phase and clear them out that way. That would also involve a lot more luck, such as rigging dodges and critical hits on our part, which is why we didn't do it. Eliwood in particular is in quite a bit of danger the way we have it already. If he was attacked by both Pegasus Knights last turn, he would have died, but we lured some of them away using Matthew and Rebecca. Matthew's position also doubles up on protecting Merlinus, who doesn't counterattack on enemy phase, so it would be very inefficient if he got attacked. We kind of have to have all these scrubs here to take care of these enemies, because our most able characters are on the left side. This does sometimes leave us vulnerable to these Pegasus Knights and their retreat AI. We already introduced that in chapter 12, and it's the same here, except in this part it's even worse, because in this part, if the Pegasus Knights decide to retreat because they're low on HP, then they would fly to the forts across the ocean, and stay there until they're healed up all the way, and then come back to us, which would obviously take way too many turns.
A similar concern can be applied to the pirates in this chapter because they also have the ability to traverse terrain that our units are not able to chase them over. If you were to leave them at too low of an HP, they might run back over the water and return to a fort and not re-engage the fray until they reach a point at which they think they're healthy enough. And the reason we harp over this so much is because there are multiple reasons to clear this chapter quickly, aside from just wanting to get a low turn count. Starting on turn 5, a couple of things happen. The first is that the rain sets in, and this game is the only one in the series that features weather that has an effect on gameplay, for a very good reason, because many players don't like it, and it doesn't really add a whole lot of things aside from frustration. What rain does is it cuts the movement range of every unit, including flyers, in half, and if you haven't nearly routed the map at that point, then that really makes the remainder of the chapter much more frustrating. Additionally, after turn 5 is when reinforcements start to appear from the forts that are not reachable, and in conjunction with the rain, it can take a while for those enemies to get to a point where they can be engaged.
Speaking of things that take a long time, we have been trying to feed as many kills as we can to Bartray on the right side, but that's not very easy because Bartray's base speed of 3 prevents him from doubling anything, not even 0 AS soldiers. If we could, we would feed him to Dorcas instead with his 6 base speed, which is much better. But alas, we have to train Bartray in order to recruit Carla later on, so that's what we're stuck with. Speaking of spoon feeding, we did something weird this turn. We once again exposed Sarah to enemy fire, even though we've always been warning the player that exposing her is a bad idea since she doesn't counter an enemy phase, but we keep doing it again and again. This time, it was so that we can spoon feed more kills to Lowen and Erik. Erik is another character that we have to train in service of a route split that happens later on, where we want to have our Guiding Ring users at a higher level than our Hero Quest users. That's also why we keep healing with Sarah, even though we don't really need to at this point in the chapter.
We just need to close out some of the stragglers, and Marcus is going to be charged with dealing with that last brigand that's still on the mountain. This is because obviously he's the person that we have the best offense and the best mobility to reach that point, and in order to one-round KO him, he just needs to use the iron sword that he has. Just a couple other things I want to point out in this chapter. There is an armory and there is a vendor, and you might think, well, Donna, why don't you try to make an effort to visit them? The answer is that this armory also does not sell javelins or hand axes, so they're pretty worthless. That's chapter 14, finished in 4 turns. We'll see you next time.
See ya.